What is the mindset of an abuser?
So what's really at the core of domestic violence is enforcement. So the abuser has a whole set of attitudes that support his behavior. And the core attitude of all of those is his belief in his right to use enforcement if he is not getting his way about things that he believes he has a right to have done in certain ways. So day-to-day life with an abuser is not about physical violence. Day-to-day life with a domestic abuser is about the woman being torn down and torn down and torn down psychologically. It's about her having her rights taken away on a broad spectrum, her right to social contact with people she wants to spend time with, her right to control her own money, and her right to have an equal say over the family's money, her right to integrity in her own body. And sexual mistreatment is such a common aspect of the domestic abuse pattern. Her right to have ambitions and her own thoughts and opinions and have a life that has its own direction. In the abuser's mindset, it's all supposed to be subsumed to who he is and what matters to him. Her needs come second, her opinions come second. And she has, in his mind, she has no inalienable rights, that her rights can be removed by him at any time, as long as in his mind, he has good enough reason to do so. And, running abuser groups, we hear, from time to time, one of the guys in the abuser group will say, I'm not one of those guys who comes home and abuses his wife for no reason. And that's a very, very telling statement when an abuser makes it, because it lets us know that he believes that he has a good enough reason, and that as long as he has a good enough reason, his behavior is justified. And we see actually in abuser groups that abusers become very critical of other abusers in the group who, if they feel that that man didn't have a good enough reason for what he did, or if they feel that the other man went too far, that he used too much abuse or too much violence. So sometimes even in the ways guys criticize other abusers, they still are revealing core aspects of how they think. That as long as you have a good enough reason, and as long as you use the right amount of abuse and the right amount of violence, then your behavior is justified. And so the actual physical violence is, those of us in domestic violence really look at that as a trump card. It's just one aspect of the abuse. It's just when he wants kind of the biggest stick to use against her, that's when he goes to physical violence, when he feels like she really has to be punished, or he really has to reassert his right to rule, then he reaches for the violence. Or another way to think of it is, he reaches for the violence when his other ways of bullying her are not working to his full satisfaction. But day-to-day life, he bullies her through all these other kinds of abuse. And this understanding is really important to how social groups and agencies and communities decide to respond to the abuser. Because if we think of his problem as just having to do with his violence, then we think, oh, well, he just blows up, he just explodes, he has inappropriate responses to conflict, and we have to settle down his temper, we have to teach him to be calmer, we have to teach him anger management, we have to help him have better responses to conflict, and we have to teach him that violence is not an appropriate way to resolve conflicts. So these are all expressions that I hear people use that are well-intentioned and entirely mistaken, because none of those little catchphrases have anything to do with why abusers are abusing, or even what their pattern of behavior looks like. The abuser is completely different from the non-abusive man all the time, not just while he's being physically violent. He's different day in and day out. His so-called good periods are different from a non-abusive man's good periods. The abuser's good periods are very self-serving, they're manipulative, he's still kind of pulling tricks below the surface, he's up to stuff all the time. This, for most abusers, it's not characterological to him, it's how he operates in intimate relationships, and it's how he thinks about intimate relationships, and he believes he has the right to operate this way This pattern of behavior is not nearly as out of control as it looks. There is so much method to the madness, and it's not rooted in psychological problems. That the domestic violence perpetrator has a particular pattern of different behaviors that trauma can't create. It actually takes a bunch of societal training and some really bad role models to create this whole fabric of behavior that virtually all domestic abusers use.
How do you talk to someone who is experiencing abuse?
So a few thoughts that come to my mind. First of all is give her 2 or 3 or 4 thoughts and leave it at that. We often want to just bombard her with an explanation of what's being done to her. It doesn't help her. It's way too much. It's too shocking. It's indigestible. So choose like 1, 2, 3, 4 points to make to her about what you're observing, and then listen. And what you're going to hear a lot from her, typically, is going to be a lot of reasons why it's not what you think. And we need to let her have room for that, not just argue back against her. And then really make sure to leave a message that the door is open.
What happens to children who are exposed to domestic violence in their home?
We need to look at the struggle that kids are having internally with deciding who's to blame for what is happening. So they're struggling from a very young age. They're struggling with whether mom is causing the things that the abuser is doing to her. And they're struggling with the question of whether they themselves are causing what's happening to mom, or whether their siblings are causing what's happening to mom. And so there's a fundamental question being grappled with here, which is the abuser responsible for his own actions, or are we all somehow causing him to do these things? Friends, relatives, professionals, if there are professionals involved, actually have to take a stand on this question with kids. You speak only critically about his behaviors. You don't say he's a this, he's an abuser, he's selfish, he's unreasonable. It's better not to put any labels on him, but just name the behavior, like that's scary behavior, or that's mean, that's a put down, that's sarcastic, that's an insult, that's demeaning. It's so helpful for kids to learn these words. That kids are noticeably less likely to internalize abuse as soon as they have words for things. And we want to say, like, mom is responsible for what she does, but she's not responsible for what he does. And you're responsible for what you do, but you're not responsible for what he does. And your siblings are responsible for what they do, but they're not responsible for what he does. And we have to go over and over and over this with kids, because the abuser, to a great extent deliberately, causes great confusion in children about whether mom is causing his behavior. And they don't just see these incidents where dad is being, or stepdad is being mean to mom, or scary to her, or assaulting her, or threatening to assault her. They're also hearing what he says about those incidents. So they're hearing the abuser say, "You pushed me too far." They're hearing the abuser say, "It's your own damn fault. If you weren't wasting all the family's money, our kids would be able to have more of this and that." And he's just got all these statements that he will openly say right in front of the kids that, whether he intends it or not, are indoctrinating those kids to have a view of the abuse that's going to cause them lifelong difficulties. And I argue quite strongly in what I write and in my public trainings that it is just as dangerous in the long run for kids to believe that the abuse is mom's fault as it is for them to believe that it's their own fault. That the children are just as likely to have mental health problems long-term from believing it's mom's fault. They're just as likely to have behavioral problems long-term from believing it's mom's fault. In fact, I would argue more likely in many ways to have behavioral problems from believing that it's mom's fault. They're headed for a lifetime of relationship problems from believing that it's mom's fault. Because if it's mom's fault now, then when you're in an adult relationship and you're being abused, it's your fault. Right? If it was mom's fault when I was growing up and it's happening to me now, it must be my fault now. And from the perspective of a boy, if it was mom's fault when I was growing up and I'm abusing my girlfriend now, it must be her fault. And actually, the research, for example, specifically finds that boys who grow up believing that it was mom's fault are the next generation of abusers. And that boys who do not grow up believing it was mom's fault do not have particularly high rates as adults of becoming abusers themselves. Then, I could talk for a long, long time about all these other issues that the research has found about how much more difficulty kids have when they're being exposed to an abuser in their school behavior, in their school learning, in their peer relationships, a higher rate of physical health problems, and just higher rate of suicidality. I mean, just all these different difficulties. The research indicates that that's not due to the conflict between the parents. It's due to the fact that the children are being exposed to abuse.
How can we address children about abuse a parent is causing?
That's what I really encourage moms in talking to kids, is to name the behavior as wrong, to name that she didn't deserve it, to name that they didn't deserve it, to name that it's his issue, not call him an abuser or anything, but just say his behavior is his issue. He needs to get help for those problems. Kids don't want to hear about punishment. They don't want to imagine dad being punished. They like the concept of help. And it's his responsibility to go get the proper help that he needs. That's not on mom or on us to somehow make him go do it. But what I encourage in some ways even more with kids is to try to talk to them about mistreatment on other fronts that doesn't have to do with him, and let them connect the dots to how that's connected to what he does. So when they're being mistreated by a friend, or they're being mistreated by a teacher or a sports coach, or when you're with your kids and you observe mistreatment being done by other adults, like in a shopping mall or at a park or anywhere else, engage your kids in conversations about what you just saw. Like, did you see how that adult was talking to that kid? Did you see that adult, slap that kid? Or did you see that adult insult that kid, or tell that kid, you better get over here or you're going to get a whipping? Whatever it is, engage the child in a conversation about that. What that signals to kids is a number of things. First, it signals to kids that it's okay for them to have their own opinions about adult behavior. Secondly, it signals to kids that some adults are really bad to kids, and that's not okay. 3, it helps kids develop the language. And I was talking about developing the language, about sarcasm and intimidation, putting the child in fear, demeaning, all those kinds of words, silencing the child, all those kinds of words. And they'll apply it to dad. In fact, they're more likely to apply it to dad if they feel like you're not talking critically about dad. So it's really better to look for other situations, particularly other people who are using behaviors that we think are kind of like the behaviors that dad or stepdad uses, that the abuser uses. Talk about those things with the kid with no reference to dad, and they will connect the dots over time.